The wind came down from the high country first. It came before the snow, before the dark, before the silence. It came in the last week of September, sliding off the spine of the Bitterroot Range like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. And it whispered things to the cabin that the cabin had no way to answer. Inside that cabin, a woman named Cordelia Thorne sat on the edge of a rope-strung bed and listened. She was 32 years old. She had buried her husband 3 weeks before. Her hands folded in her lap were the hands of a woman who had once embroidered handkerchiefs and turned the pages of borrowed novels and held a teacup with 2 fingers raised, and they did not yet look like the hands she would have by spring. They did not yet know what they would be asked to do. She wore black as a widow was expected to wear, but the black had gone gray at the elbows and the cuffs, and there was a smear of road dust along the hem that she had not the strength to brush away. Her hair, the color of wet birch bark, was pulled back tight enough to pull at the corners of her eyes. Her eyes were the color of weak coffee, and they were dry. She had not cried in 2 days. She suspected she might never cry again. Grief, she had discovered, was not a flood. It was a long, slow draining like water leaking out of a wooden barrel, one drop at a time. And after enough of it had gone, there was simply nothing left inside her to fall. Outside, the aspens were turning. They were the color of held breath. The cottonwoods along the creek bottom had already gone the color of beaten brass, and the wind moved through them with a sound like 1,000 small coins being counted. Her name was Cordelia. But no one had called her that for 10 years. Her husband had called her Della. The men at the bank in Helena had called her Mrs. Thorne. The undertaker had called her Ma'am, and the priest had called her My Child. And the men with the wagons who came to take her furniture had called her nothing at all, because to them she had been a kind of stage on which a debt was being collected. And the stage was not a person and did not need a name. She thought of Ezra now, not the Ezra who had died, the gray and shrinking Ezra of the last weeks. The Ezra whose lungs had filled with something that sounded when he breathed like a man wading through wet leaves. She thought of the Ezra who had stood in the door of a bookshop on Last Chance Gulch 8 summers before, holding a thin volume of Wordsworth and grinning at her like a boy who had found a coin in the street. The Ezra who had read to her on Sunday afternoons in the parlor of her father's house, his voice careful and slow as if each word were a delicate cup he was afraid to chip. The Ezra who had told her the night before their wedding that he intended to build her a house with windows on every wall, because a woman like her, he said, was meant to live in light. He had built her no such house. He had built her instead this: a box of unpeeled logs, 14 feet by 16, chinked with mud, that had given up its hold on the wood years before, a roof of split shakes, half of which had curled at the edges like dead leaves, a single window with a single pane of glass that had a long diagonal crack across it, as if something had once struck it from outside and could not get in, a stovepipe that listed 3 degrees off plumb, a door that did not quite close, and 10 acres. The deed lay folded inside her Bible on the small table by the bed, and the deed said 10 acres, and the deed lied. Or rather, the deed told a kind of truth that was indistinguishable from a lie. There were 10 acres, but 9 of them stood on end. They rose behind the cabin in a vast humped shoulder of gray granite and shale, a hillside so steep that in the spring the melting snow would shed rocks down it, like a dog shedding hair, and so high that the snow would lie on its northern face until well into June. The 10th acre was flat. The 10th acre was where she sat. The 10th acre was the joke at the end of a long and patient confidence game. And Ezra had paid $400 for it. And Ezra was dead, and the $400 was gone. And the man who had sold it to him was, she had been told now, somewhere in the territory of Arizona, where the winters were said to be very pleasant. She rose from the bed. She had things to do. There were always things to do, and the things did not care whether a woman was inclined to do them. She crossed the cabin in 4 steps. She bent, and from the small wooden trunk at the foot of the bed, she took her husband's Bible. It was the only book the creditors had left her, and they had left it only because it was inscribed on the flyleaf. To her in her father's hand, the year she had turned 16. The creditors had been many things, but they had not been men who took a Bible from a widow with her own name written in it. She opened it. She did not open it to read. She opened it because she had taken to opening it in the long silences of these 3 weeks, the way another woman might have taken to drink. She would open it at random and put her finger on a verse and read the verse and close the book again. And the verses meant nothing to her, and the meaning of nothing was just now the only meaning she could bear. But this time, when she opened it, the pages did not part where they usually parted. They parted in the middle of the book of Job, and tucked between the pages folded once and creased sharp was a piece of paper she had never seen before. She stood very still. The wind under the door fingered the hem of her dress. She took the paper out. It was a single sheet torn from the ledger book Ezra had kept for his accounts, and it was covered in his handwriting on both sides. The handwriting was bad. It was the handwriting of a man writing in bed by candlelight with his hand shaking. It was dated August the 12th, which meant he had written it 9 days before he died. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and she read it. My dear Della, if you are reading this, then I have not found the courage to say it to you, and I have run out of time to find that courage, and I am sorry for that. I'm sorry for a great many things, but that one I am sorry for most of all. The land is bad, you will know this by now. The man who sold it to me was a liar, and I knew in some part of me that he was a liar, even on the day I gave him the money. I am writing this not to make excuses, but because there is something I want you to know, and I do not want you to throw the paper into the stove before you have read to the end. Will you promise me that? Read to the end. She did not promise. She read on. Last October, before I took sick the first time I was hunting elk on the upper benches above the cabin. I did not get an elk. The weather turned on me very fast the way it does up there, and I was caught 2 miles from any shelter when a wind came down off the peaks that I have never felt the like of. I am not a strong man, Della. You and I both know this. I should have died on that hillside. I should have lain down in a drift and gone to sleep the way men do. I did not die because of the hill. I do not know how else to say it. I had crouched behind a boulder, and I had begun to lose feeling in my hands. And then I felt a thing I cannot account for. A warmth. Not a fire's warmth. A slow, even warmth coming up through the rock at my back. I pressed my face to the rock, and the rock was warmer than the air. It was as if the hill itself were breathing. I stayed there until the wind died. I walked home. I did not tell you about this because you would have thought, and rightly, that I had been too long in the cold. But I went back, Della. I went back 4 times that fall. I found the place where I had crouched. I found other places. The hill is not what they think it is. The hill is warmer than the wind. There is a thing in the rock and the earth that holds the summer's heat all winter, and it gives it back slowly to anyone who knows where to lay his hand. I bought the land for that. I did not buy it for the timber, which is poor, or for the pasture, which is nothing, or for the granite, which my brother will tell you is worth pennies on the ton. I bought it because I thought if a man could learn to live in the way the hill itself lives, he could survive a winter in this country that would kill any other man. I never learned how. I am not the man to have learned how. But you, Della, you are stronger than I have ever been. You have always been stronger than me, and we have both pretended otherwise. because that is the way of the world, and I was a coward to let us pretend. Listen for the hill. Promise me. Listen for the hill. I love you. I have always loved you. I am sorry I have left you with so little. Your husband, Ezra. She read it twice. She read it 3 times. She did not know the first time that she was holding her breath, and when she finished the first reading, she let the breath out in a long, shuddering rush that was almost a sob, and was not quite a sob. She read it again because she did not believe it. She read it a 3rd time because she did believe it, and she did not want to. Then she stood up. She walked the 4 steps to the cast-iron stove in the corner. She opened the stove's small black door. Inside there was a low bed of coals, the last of the morning's fire. She held the paper above the coals. The heat rose against the back of her hand. A poet, she thought. A poet to the end. A poet who heard a hill speaking to him and bought 10 acres of worthless ground on the strength of it, and left his wife with the bill. Her hand trembled. She moved the paper closer to the coals. The corner of the page began to brown, and she stopped. She did not know why she stopped. She would think about it many times in the years to come, sitting in a chair in a room she had not yet imagined, and she would never be entirely sure what stayed her hand. Perhaps it was only that the handwriting was his, and there would never be any more of his handwriting in the world. And to burn even this much of it felt like burning a piece of his actual body. Perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was the wind under the door which at that moment gave a low, long whine, like an animal asking to be let in. And the whine seemed for a foolish second to be the whine of the hill itself, asking her to wait. She drew the paper back. She folded it. She put it back inside the Bible in the middle of the book of Job, and she closed the Bible and set it on the table. Then she stood at the window with the cracked pane and looked out at the hill. It rose above the cabin like the back of some enormous animal, sleeping under a thin gray blanket. The aspens on its lower slopes were going gold. Higher up where the rock began to show through the granite was the color of an old gun barrel. Higher still, the first snow had come the night before and had not melted, and it lay along the high benches in long pale streaks like the marks of a finger drawn through dust. She had hated the hill from the moment she first saw it. She hated it still. But for the first time looking at it, she felt the hill notice her back. The wagon came 2 days later. She heard it before she saw it. She was on her knees at the back wall of the cabin, packing wet clay into a gap in the chinking between 2 of the lower logs. Her sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Her forearms streaked to the wrist with red mud. The sound of the wagon came up the wash track from the south. Slow and heavy, the iron tires clattering over loose stone, and she knew before she saw the team who it would be. There was only one wagon in the country with springs that fine. She heard the springs. She did not stand. She finished the gap she was working on. Then she wiped her hands on a rag slowly, finger by finger, and she stood. Garrett Thorne reined the team in at the edge of what had once briefly been a yard. He sat on the wagon seat in a coat of gray broadcloth with black braiding at the cuffs, and a hat with a flat brim and a high crown. And he did not get down. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the woodpile, which was small. He looked at the slope of the hill. He looked at her. He was 38 years old. He was 4 years older than his brother had been. And he was a head taller, and he was in every measurable way the more successful man. He owned 640 acres of bottomland east of Pine Hollow. He owned a frame house with a parlor and an upright piano that no one in it knew how to play. He owned an interest in the new flour mill on Willow Creek. He was a vestryman at the church. He had buried his brother with quiet, expensive dignity, and he had paid for the stone, and the stone had his brother's name on it, and the dates and nothing else, because he had told the mason there was nothing else worth saying. He looked at his sister-in-law now the way a man looks at a piece of property he is considering, and has already decided he will buy. "Della," he said. "Garrett," she said. "You've been out here 3 weeks." "I have." "The town is talking. The town is welcome to talk." He did not smile. Garrett Thorne smiled when he smiled the way another man might draw a pistol, and he had not yet decided whether the moment called for it. "I came up to make you an offer," he said. "I assumed." He climbed down from the wagon at last. He did it slowly, the way a heavy man does, although he was not heavy. He was rather a man who had learned the value of moving as if he were heavier than he was, because heavier men were taken more seriously. He stood by the wheel and put one gloved hand on the spokes. $50, he said. She said nothing. $50, he said again, for the granite rights. You keep the deed. You keep the cabin such as it is. You can come into town and take a room at the Widow Hennessy's for $2 a week, and the 50 will keep you in that room through April. And by April, the snow will be off the passes, and you can go down to your sister in St. Paul, and you can put all this behind you, Della, all of it. My sister, she said, did not write to me when Ezra died." He looked away. Even so, she said, $50. It is more than the granite is worth. It is exactly what the granite is worth, she said. To anyone but you. You would not be offering it if it were only worth 50. He turned his eyes back to her. There was, for the first time, something hard and bright in them, something that had nothing to do with the cold. The granite, he said, is worth $50. The land it sits on is worth nothing. The cabin is worth less than nothing because it will fall down on top of whoever is fool enough to be inside it. I am offering you, sister, the price of a coffin, because I do not want the next coffin in this family to be yours. And I do not want my brother's widow on my conscience when the spring thaw comes and they have to chip her out of a drift. She held his eyes. "No," she said. He blew out a long breath through his nose. He looked at the hill. He looked back at her. "This place," he said very quietly, "is a headstone, Della. It is a headstone waiting for a name. You are standing on your own grave, and you are too proud to step off it. My brother put you on it, and you are too loyal to a dead fool to admit that he did." The word fool went into her like a thin, cold blade. She did not let it show on her face. "Get back on your wagon," she said. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he turned. He set his boot on the hub. He hauled himself up to the seat. He gathered the reins. He did not pick up the whip. "The first hard freeze," he said, looking down at her, "will bring you to your senses, or it will kill you. Either way, the offer stands." He clucked to the team. The wagon turned. The springs sang. He went back down the wash track, and the sound of the iron tires faded into the distance, and the wind came back up and filled the silence he had left behind. She stood there a long time. She stood until her hands were cold. Then she walked slowly to where the wagon had been turned. There in the rutted dirt by the print of the near wheel lay a folded piece of stiff paper. It had fallen, she would think later, from the inside breast pocket of his coat when he had braced his hand on the spokes. She did not know that yet. She knew only that there was a paper, and the paper was not hers, and the paper had been in the pocket of a man who had just called her husband a fool. She bent and picked it up. She unfolded it on the chopping block by the back door because there was no flat, clean place inside, and the wind kept trying to take the corners. She set rocks on 3 corners and held the 4th with her hand. It was a map. It was a map drawn in the hard, precise hand of a railroad surveyor. The paper was the cream-colored bond of an engineering office. The legend in the lower right corner read, Northern Pacific Railway Company Division of Way and Structures, Preliminary Survey Bitterroot Extension. And beneath that, in smaller letters, the names of 2 engineers and a date in the spring of that year. She bent close. She read the map slowly. She had been a school teacher for 2 years before her marriage, and she could read a map. The line came up the valley from the south. It crossed the river at a point she knew 3 miles below the cabin, where the bank was low, and the gravel was good. Then it climbed. It climbed along the eastern flank of the valley for a mile, and then it bent west and it crossed. It crossed her ground. The dotted line, the line marked proposed route, ran straight through the flat 10th acre on which the cabin stood. It ran along the foot of the hill she had been told was worthless. There were 3 small triangles drawn in pencil along the line within her property, and the triangles she knew from her father's old surveying book meant proposed siding. A siding meant a place where trains would stop. A place where trains stopped became in time a town. She straightened up. She did not at first feel anything. She felt instead a kind of clean, cold clarity, like the clarity of the air at the top of a high pass. She understood all at once and without effort a great many things. She understood why Garrett had come out himself in his good coat, in his good wagon with $50 in his pocket. She understood why he had not sent a lawyer. A lawyer would have asked questions. A lawyer would have made a record. Garrett had come himself because Garrett did not want a record. She understood why he had called her husband a fool. A man who has stolen something from his brother needs very badly to believe his brother was a fool. The belief is the only thing that lets the man sleep. She understood that her husband in the last weeks of his life had owned without knowing it a piece of ground that was about to be worth 100 times what he had paid for it. She understood that her husband had died and the deed had passed to her, and her brother-in-law had ridden up to her cabin with a coffin's worth of money in his pocket and tried to buy from her the thing that would have made her rich. She understood finally why Ezra's letter had been hidden in the Bible. Not because Ezra had wanted to hide it, because Ezra had known his brother. Because Ezra had known that if his brother ever found that letter, his brother would burn it, and the hill and the hill's strange warmth and everything his brother had ever dreamed would go up with it. She stood at the chopping block, and she folded the map back along its creases. She folded it small. She slid it inside the bodice of her dress against her ribs, where the paper was cold for a moment against her skin, and then was warm. She looked up at the hill. "All right," she said, to no one. "All right." The first hard frost came on a Friday night in the 2nd week of October. She woke in the dark and knew it before she opened her eyes, because the air in the cabin had a different weight to it, a different smell. She got up and pulled the blanket around her shoulders and went to the window. The cracked pane was etched on the inside with fern patterns of ice. She scraped at one with her thumbnail and looked out. The world had gone white at the edges. Every blade of grass, every weed stalk, every fallen leaf was rimmed in a fine white fur of frost, and the moon, which was 3 nights past, the full lay on it all like a coin laid flat on a tabletop. The hill was very black against the sky. She did not go back to sleep. In the morning, she walked the 4 miles to Pine Hollow. She needed flour. She needed lamp oil. She needed more than she needed either of those to look at other faces. Pine Hollow was a single street and 7 buildings. There was a church, a school that doubled as a meeting hall, 2 saloons, a livery, a blacksmith, and Silas Crow's general store. The store stood at the south end of the street. It had a long porch with a worn pine bench and a black dog of indeterminate breed that lay on the bench in all weather and did not move when she stepped over it. The bell above the door rang. Inside the store smelled the way every such store in that country smelled in October. It smelled of coffee beans and harness leather and pine sawdust and cured ham and the faint sweet rot of last summer's apples in a barrel near the back. Silas Crow stood behind the counter. He was 60 years old. His hair was the color of bleached bone, cut short on the sides and a little long on top, and he combed it back with his fingers when he was thinking. His face was the face of a man who had not been surprised by anything in a long time and did not expect to be. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue. He was wiping the counter with a gray rag, and he set the rag down when the bell rang, and he looked at her, and he did not smile, and he did not frown. "Mrs. Thorne," he said. "Mr. Crow, coffee's on the stove. Help yourself." She did. There was a tin cup on a nail beside the stove. She filled it. She wrapped both hands around it and did not drink at once. She let the heat go up into her wrists. There were 3 other men in the store. 2 were old, sitting by the stove on upended crates playing checkers on a board scratched into the wood of the cracker barrel. The third was a younger man in a buffalo coat picking through a tray of nails. None of them spoke to her. The 2 old men nodded. The younger man did not look up. Silas waited. He was good at waiting. She had learned that in the few times she had been in his store before Ezra's death when she had come in on Ezra's arm. Silas was a man who would let a silence run as long as the silence wanted to run, and he did not appear to grow uncomfortable in it. And after a while you understood that the silence was a kind of room he kept, and you were welcome to sit in it as long as you needed to. After a while she said, "What are they saying?" "About the winter." Silas folded the rag and put it under the counter. He set both hands flat on the wood. "Goosebones dark all the way down," he said. "Squirrel fat is 2 fingers thick on a squirrel that ought to be 1. The Olafson boy shot a porcupine last week with a coat on it like a bear's. Old Bill Mercer says he hasn't seen the asters bloom this late since '72, and '72 was the year we lost the Hollander family up at Trout Lake." He paused. "They're saying Wolf Winter, Mrs. Thorne." "Wolf Winter," she repeated. "The kind he said that comes down out of Alberta and sits on this country for 10 weeks and doesn't move. The kind that freezes the sap in standing trees. You hear them pop in the night like rifle shots when the cold gets into them. The kind that kills the weak and the unprepared, and a fair number of the strong and the ready, too." She looked into her coffee. "I see," she said. He watched her. He combed his hair back with 2 fingers. "Mrs. Thorne, he said your husband was a customer of mine for 6 years. I liked him. He was not a practical man, but I liked him. There is a room at the back of the parsonage that the Reverend Hollis keeps for widows. It is a clean room, and the Reverend is a decent man, and his wife is a better one. You would not be the first woman to spend a winter in that room. You would not be the last. There is no shame in it." "There is no shame in it," she said. "None." She nodded slowly. She set the cup down on the counter. "I have a home, Mr. Crow," she said. "I only need to make it ready." He looked at her a long moment. Then, very slightly, he nodded. He did not argue. He turned and reached down a sack of flour from the shelf behind him and set it on the counter, and he asked her what else she needed. And they did the small commerce of the morning, and neither of them spoke again of the winter or the cabin or the room at the back of the parsonage. She walked home with the flour and the lamp oil in a canvas sack across her shoulder. She walked along the wagon track that followed the creek, and the day had warmed enough that the frost was gone from the south sides of things, and the willows along the water were bare and red-stemmed and very bright in the low sun. A mile from the cabin, she came to the place where the trail crossed the creek on a flat slab of granite that had been worn smooth by 60 years of hooves. The creek had not yet frozen there. The water ran black and quick over a bed of pale stones. And on the far side of the crossing, on a fallen cottonwood log, sat an old man. She had never seen him before. He was very old. He was past 70, perhaps, past 75. His face was the color of saddle leather and as creased. His beard was white and short and squared off at the bottom in the way of an old soldier. He wore a long oilcloth coat the color of an oak gall, and a wool cap pulled down to his eyebrows, and on his lap he held of all things a willow fishing rod. The line went down from the tip of the rod into the black water. He did not appear to be paying it any attention. He looked up as she crossed the slab. "Ma'am," he said. "Sir," she said. She would have walked on. But he said without preamble, as if continuing a conversation that had been going on between them for some time, "You'd be the widow up at the Thorn place." She stopped. "I would." He nodded as if she had confirmed something he had already known. He drew the line up out of the water. There was no bait on the hook. There never had been, she suspected. The rod was a prop. "Sit down a minute," he said, "if you've the time. My name is Mose Tillman. I worked the Anaconda Hill for 31 years, and the Granite Mountain before that. And I am too old to be useful to anyone now, including myself. But I have one thing to say to you, and then I will get out of your road." She did not sit. She stood on the slab with the sack across her shoulder, and she looked at him. "What is it?" she said. He laid the rod across his knees. "I knew your husband," he said. "Not well. He came into the assay office in Phillipsburg one afternoon 2 winters back with a piece of rock in his pocket, and he wanted to know if it was anything. It wasn't anything. It was country rock. But we got to talking, your husband and me, and he told me about a hill he had been on, where the rock was warmer than the wind. And I told him a thing, ma'am, and I will tell you the same thing now because I think he is past needing it. And you are not." She set the sack down on the slab. "Tell me," she said. "I worked underground," Mose Tillman said, "for 31 years. The deep levels of the Anaconda, 2,000 feet down, 3,000 feet down. And I will tell you a thing that no one above the ground ever quite believes, and that every man who has worked below it knows in his bones. The earth, ma'am, the deep earth, holds a temperature. It holds it the year round. Down at the 800 level in January, when it is 40 below at the collar of the shaft, it is 58 degrees on the drift. In July, when it is 90 in the shade, it is 58 degrees on the drift. The earth does not know about the weather. The earth keeps its own counsel. It is, you might say, a great slow animal that has been asleep so long it has forgotten how to wake up, and it breathes out very gently, the heat of an old summer. It can no longer remember, and it breathes that heat out all winter long, year after year. And a man with the sense God gave a badger can put his shelter where that breath is." She did not move. "Your husband," he said, "felt that breath on a hillside. He felt it through the rock. I told him then what I will tell you now. The hill is not your enemy. The cabin is your enemy. The wind is your enemy. The cold above the ground is your enemy. The hill is the only friend you have got in this country in October, with a wolf winter coming. You can fight the cold above the ground, ma'am, or you can go to where the cold cannot reach. Those are your 2 roads. Most folks take the first one, because they do not know there is a second." He reached into the inside of his oilcloth coat. He brought out a folded piece of paper. It was much folded, and the creases were soft with age. "This," he said, "was drawn by a man named Eberly, who came up to this country in the year of 49 from the old country, and who built himself a place on the South Fork. that was warm in the worst winter ever, to come down on this valley, which was the winter of '66. He drew it for his nephew. His nephew gave it to me. I have not had a use for it, ma'am, in 20 years. You will. He held it out. She crossed the slab. She took the paper from his hand. His hand was warm. She had expected for some reason that it would be cold. She unfolded the paper. It was a drawing in pencil, careful and neat. It showed a hillside in cross-section. It showed a chamber cut back into the hill, and a passage leading from the chamber to a small surface structure, and a stovepipe running up and out through the slope. There were notations in a tight European hand. There were measurements in feet and inches. There was a small note at the bottom that read, in English, "Keep the pipe long. The draft is your life." She looked up. "Why," she said, "why are you giving this to me?" Mose Tillman picked up his fishing rod. He laid the line back into the black water. He did not look at her. "Because I am 80 years old," he said, "and I will not see another winter, and a thing like this should not be in the pocket of a dead man. Take it home, ma'am. Read it tonight by your lamp. Then do what your husband did not have the years to do." She stood with the paper in her hand. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "I haven't done anything but hand you a paper. The doing is yours." She turned. She picked up the sack. She crossed back to her side of the creek. When she had gone 20 paces, she looked back. The old man was gone. The log was there. The water ran over the pale stones. There was no figure on the log, and no figure on the trail in either direction. And the ground was soft enough on the bank that she could see very plainly where she had stepped, and where the deer had stepped, and nowhere at all could she see the print of a boot that was not hers. She stood a long moment looking at the empty log. Then she walked on. That afternoon the wind came up hard. It came down off the high country with a voice in it that was lower and longer than any wind she had heard in that place yet. And it shook the cabin until the dishes on the shelf chattered against each other, like teeth. She tried to mend a patch of sod on the north side of the roof, and was nearly blown from the ladder. She climbed down. She stood at the corner of the cabin, holding her hat to her head with both hands, and she looked at the hill. And she could no longer see the top of it for the snow blowing off the ridge. She turned in the wind to put her back to it, and she saw 50 yards behind the cabin the dark mouth of a thing she had walked past a dozen times and never quite registered. It was half hidden behind a tangle of overgrown hawthorn. The hawthorn had a hold on the slope in that one place where the granite gave way to a softer stratum of clay and pebble, and behind it, the slope had been cut into long ago by some hand that was no longer in the country. There had been a door there once. The hinges were still set into the rock. The door itself had gone rotted to splinters and rust lying in a brown line on the ground. What remained was an opening about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, dark square at the top, and from it came no wind at all. She crossed to it through the hawthorn. The thorns dragged at her sleeves. She bent and stepped inside. She stepped in one step out of the world she had been living in, and into a different one. The wind was gone. Not muffled, not lessened, gone the way a sound is gone when a door is shut behind you. The roar she had been living inside of for an hour, for a week, for the whole of her life on this ground simply ended. In its place was a silence so complete that she could hear very distinctly the small ticking sound her own pulse made in her ears. And the air against her face was a different air. It was cool. It was damp, but it was, she understood after a moment of standing very still, warmer than the air outside by some 20 or 30 degrees. It was the temperature of a root cellar in May. It was a temperature that did not move and did not change. And it had been holding itself at that temperature she now understood for the whole of this October, and for every October before this one. While above it the wind had screamed and the frost had come, and the world had gone hard, and the air in here had not noticed and had not cared. She put her hand on the wall of the little chamber. The wall was packed earth and stone. It was cool to the touch. It was, she would have said, faintly alive. The hill is warmer than the wind, she thought. The hill is warmer than the wind. The hill is warmer than the wind. She felt in her bodice against her ribs the cold square of the map. She felt in the pocket of her apron the folded drawing of the old Bavarian who had built himself a chamber on the South Fork and had survived the winter of '66. She felt on the table at the cabin in the Bible in the book of Job, the letter from a man whose ashes she had not yet decided what to do with. 3 pieces of paper, 3 voices. A husband who had felt this thing through stone and had not lived to use it. A railroad that did not know yet that it had laid its line across the property of a widow it had never met. An old miner on a log who was now perhaps not there at all. She stood inside the hill in the strange held warmth of it, and she felt for the first time since Ezra's death a thing rise in her chest that was not grief. It was not hope exactly. Hope was a thing for spring, for thaw, for green shoots. This was something darker and older and harder, a thing made of bone and rock, a thing that had been waiting in her all along under the embroidery and the teacups and the borrowed novels, waiting for a country that would call it up. It was purpose. She stayed in the chamber until her feet went cold through her boots. Then she ducked back out under the lintel of black hinge-marked stone, into the howling wind, into the gray world, into the last of the daylight. The wind hit her like a hand. She bent her head into it. She walked the 50 yards back to the cabin. At the door she stopped and turned and looked at the hill. "All right," she said again into the wind. The wind took the words and tore them up and threw them away, but she did not need the wind to keep them. They were not for the wind. "All right," she said. "I hear you." She went inside. She shut the door. She lit the lamp. She took the Bavarian's drawing from her apron pocket and the railroad map from her bodice, and she laid them both flat on the table next to the Bible. And she sat down in the one chair, and she began by lamplight, in the long howl of an autumn wind that would in time become a winter, to read. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the small pine table with the lamp turned low, and the Bavarian's drawing spread flat between her hands, and she read it the way another woman might have read a letter from a lover, line by line, and back again, and she did not feel the cold, and she did not feel the hours pass. The drawing was a marvel of patience. The old man Eberle, whoever he had been a man who believed in pencil. Every measurement was set down in a small, neat hand and underlined twice. Every angle had its number. The slope of the passage was given in inches of rise per foot of run. The thickness of the stone facing was given in courses. The depth of the chamber from the line of the surface was given in feet, and the figure was 11. And beside it, in parenthesis, the old Bavarian had written in the only piece of English on the whole sheet, no less. She understood, sitting there, that she was looking at the work of a man who had taught himself to be afraid in a particular way. He had been afraid of cold, and his fear had taken the form of arithmetic. She had been raised by a father who was an attorney, and she knew the kind of fear that took the form of words on a page. She had not until tonight known there was a kind of fear that took the form of pencil lines on a sectional drawing of a hillside. She felt, looking at it, an unexpected kinship with the old man Eberle. He had been afraid the way she was afraid. He had answered his fear with measurements the way she had once answered hers, with verses underlined in a Bible. When the lamp guttered, she trimmed the wick. At some point in the small hours, she put her head down on her arms, and she did not mean to sleep, but she slept. When she woke, the lamp had gone out, and there was a thin gray light at the cracked window, and the wind had dropped, and the cabin was so cold she could see her breath in front of her in a single long plume, and her shoulder ached from the angle of her sleeping. She got up. She built up the fire. She put the coffee on. She stood by the stove with her hands held out flat to the warmth. And she made that morning while the coffee heated the decision that would shape every day of her life for the next 10 weeks. She would not move into the chamber she had found. The chamber she had found was too small. The chamber she had found was a starting point. The chamber she had found was where Eberly, if he had stood beside her, would have laid his hand on the wall and said in his careful European English, "Here is where we begin." She would dig. She would dig back into the hill, and she would dig down, and she would carve a room large enough to hold a stove and a bed and a chair and a winter's worth of firewood. And she would line that room with stone, and she would cut a passage from the room to the cabin, and the cabin would become not her home, but the porch of her home, the cold mouth through which a person passed on the way to the warm, dark center of things. She would do this with her own 2 hands. She would do it because there was no one else to do it. She would do it before the wolf winter came, and she would do it whether the country thought her mad or did not. And she would if she had to die doing it, because the alternative was to die not doing it. And of those two, she preferred the first. She drank the coffee. She put on Ezra's old wool coat over her dress because her own coat had gone the way of the furniture. She tied a kerchief over her hair. She walked the 4 miles to Pine Hollow for the second time in 2 days. The black dog on the porch of Silas Crow's store lifted its head when she stepped over it and then put its head back down, as if she had already become, in the dog's estimation, a regular feature of the landscape. Inside, Silas was sweeping. He set the broom against the wall when the bell rang. He looked at her. He did not say good morning. He never said good morning. He said, "Mrs. Thorne." "Mr. Crow," she said, "I need a pickaxe head. A new helve if you have one fitted. A long-handled shovel, the heavy kind, not the garden kind. 2 dozen candles, tallow if you have them, and beeswax if you do not. A ball of stout twine. A short-handled sledge of about 6 pounds. And a box of black powder if you carry it, and slow match." Silas Crow did not move. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he looked at her for a long count of 3. Then he combed his hair back with 2 fingers. "No powder," he said. "I won't sell you powder, Mrs. Thorne. Not for what you would use it for. And you would use it for the only thing it is good for in October. And I won't have that on my hands. The rest, yes." She nodded once. "The rest, then." He moved. He went down the long aisle to the back of the store, and he gathered the things one at a time, and he laid them on the counter in the order she had named them. He fitted the pickaxe head to a hickory helve himself, with a wedge and a tap of a small hammer, and he set the finished tool on the counter with the head pointing away from her the way a man sets a knife down for another man. He totaled the prices on a scrap of brown paper with the stub of a pencil. He turned the paper around and slid it across the counter. The figure at the bottom was $12.40. She had in the small leather purse inside the bodice of her dress $14.17. It was every cent in the world that belonged to her. She counted out $12.40 in silver and copper, and she pushed it across the counter. Silas Crow looked at the coins. He did not pick them up. "Mrs. Thorne," he said. "Mr. Crow, that is a digging outfit." "It is. The ground will be frozen in 2 weeks. I am not digging new ground. I am opening up an old root cellar." He looked at her. The pale, washed-out eyes did not blink. "A root cellar," he said. "A root cellar." He drew a slow breath. He let it out. He picked up the coins one at a time and dropped them through the brass slot in the top of the cash drawer. Each coin made a small, bright sound. "There's a man," he said, not looking at her, "who came through here last spring out of Phillipsburg. He was selling timbering props for the mines, square sawn dressed at the ends. He had some left over, and he sold them to me for the cost of the freight, because he did not want to haul them back. And I bought them because they were cheap, and I thought I might sell them for cribbing on a new well. They are stacked behind the store. There are 42 of them. They are 5 feet long and 6 inches square. I will not be selling them this winter, and they will warp if they sit through to spring. If you can find a way to get them up to your place, Mrs. Thorne, you can have them for the price of the freight, which is nothing because I have already paid it." She looked at him. "Mr. Crow," she said, "I have not done you a kindness, Mrs. Thorne. I have done myself one. I have moved a thing that was in my way." "Mr. Crow," she said again. He turned and busied himself with something on the back shelf that did not need to be busied with. He did not turn back until she had gathered her parcels and lifted them. And even then he only nodded at her and did not speak. And she stepped over the black dog on the porch and went down the steps into the morning. And the morning had become, while she had been inside, something different than it had been when she went in. She hired the Olafson boy, who was 16 and strong, and would do anything for $1 to bring the 42 timbers up to the cabin on his father's flat wagon. He did it in 2 trips on the same day. He looked at the cabin and at the mouth of the chamber, half hidden behind the hawthorn, and he looked at her, and he did not say anything because he was 16 and had been raised to know that there were things a 16-year-old boy did not ask a widow. He took his $1 and he drove away. By dusk, the timbers were stacked along the north wall of the cabin under a tarp, and Cordelia Thorne stood with the pickaxe in her hand at the mouth of the old root cellar. And she swung. The first swing rang off a piece of granite an inch under the dirt and sent a shock up her arms that she felt in her teeth. The pickaxe head bounced. She nearly lost hold of the helve. She set her feet. She swung again. The second swing went into clay and stuck there. She had to set her boot against the wall to lever it loose. The third swing struck rock again, glanced, and tore a long red welt across the soft web of skin between her left thumb and forefinger. She looked at the welt. The welt began to bleed. She swung again. She would learn in the days that followed that there was a way to swing a pickaxe that did not destroy a person's hands. And there was a way to swing one that did. She would learn the difference, one blister at a time. By the end of the first day, there were 4 blisters on her right palm and 3 on her left, and 2 of them had broken. And the inside of Ezra's leather work glove, which she had taken from the peg by the door, because she had nothing else, was sticky with a mixture of blood and lymph that she would not bother to clean off because by morning it would be there again. By the end of the first week, the blisters had broken and broken again, and the broken places had begun to harden into a pale yellow callus that ran across the base of all 4 fingers of each hand, and the calluses had begun to crack along their seams, and the cracks bled in the cold and did not heal. Her hands at night by the lamp looked like the hands of a stranger. They looked like the hands of a man who had worked a hammer in a forge for 20 years. She would stare at them and not entirely believe they were hers, and then she would rub them with bacon grease, which was the only thing she had, and she would wrap them in strips of an old petticoat torn for the purpose, and she would sleep with them wrapped. And in the morning, the bacon grease would have soaked through the petticoat strips, and she would unwrap them and rinse them in cold water. and put them back into Ezra's gloves, and she would go out and swing the pickaxe again. She developed a rhythm. There was no other way to do the work. The body could not be commanded the way a horse could be commanded. The body could only be coaxed into a kind of mindless cooperation, and the coaxing was done through repetition, through a pattern of motion so steady and unchanging that the body forgot it was tired and went on swinging the pickaxe out of habit alone. She swung from the shoulders, not the arms. She let the weight of the head do the work and only guided it down. She breathed out on the swing, in on the recovery. She counted in groups of 20, and after every set of 20, she let the head of the pick rest on the ground and stood with her hands on the helve and counted slowly to 10, and on 10 she lifted again. And she did this from the moment the gray light was strong enough to see by until the gray light failed. And she ate when she remembered to eat, and she drank when she remembered to drink, and she stopped only when the light was gone and she could no longer see the wall in front of her. The chamber grew. By the end of the first week, she could stand upright in it just. By the end of the second, she had widened it to 8 feet across and deepened it to 10 feet back from the original opening. And the floor was a mound of broken stone and clay that she hauled out bucket by bucket in a wooden water bucket she had emptied of its hoops twice and re-hooped both times with bands cut from a broken barrel. She dumped the spoil into a growing mound behind the cabin. The mound by the end of the second week was taller than she was. She learned to read the stone. She learned that the granite of the hill was not one solid mass the way it appeared from outside, but a thing veined and faulted, run through with seams of softer rock and bands of clay, and the occasional surprising pocket of pure white quartz the size of her fist. She learned to look for the seams. She learned that a swing of the pickaxe placed at the right angle along a seam would split off a piece of stone weighing 50 pounds, and the same swing placed 3 inches to the left of the seam would do nothing at all but jar her shoulders. She learned to read the wall the way she had once learned as a girl, to read the page of a difficult book, and she learned that the wall, like the book, would yield to a patient reader and would refuse a hasty one. The rumors began to reach Pine Hollow before the end of the second week. She would not know this until later. The trappers came down from the upper benches on their way to sell pelts, and they passed within half a mile of her property. And what they heard from there all day and into the evenings was the steady chip and ring of metal on stone echoing out of the hillside, as if the hill itself had begun very slowly to chew on something. They said so in the saloons. They said so to the women who served them in the saloons, and the women said so to other women. And by the end of October, there was no one in Pine Hollow who had not heard that the widow Thorne was up at the old worthless place digging, always digging. And the children of the town had begun to dare each other to creep along the ridge above her cabin and look down at her, and they crept, and they looked, and they ran home with their stories. And the stories grew with each telling. And by the first week of November, the story being told in the back rooms of the saloons was that the mole woman of the Bitterroot had begun to grow fur on her hands and to eat raw rabbit by the light of a single candle, and that she spoke to the rocks in the language they spoke back to her. She knew none of this. She knew only that she had to be inside the hill by the night of the first hard storm. And so she swung. It was on a Thursday late in the last week of October that the men came. She had been asleep less than an hour. She had taken to sleeping in her clothes with the loaded Winchester rifle that had belonged to Ezra propped beside the bed, within reach of her right hand, because she had begun to be afraid in a way she had not been afraid before of the sounds the cabin made at night when the wind worked at its corners. The rifle had been Ezra's only inheritance from his own father. It was a Model 1873 octagonal barrel, the bluing worn pale along the loading gate from the hands of a man who had carried it 20 years. She had cleaned it. She had loaded it. She had fired it once at a stump to be sure she remembered how. She did remember how. She woke to the smell of kerosene. It was a small smell at first. She lay very still, and she thought for a confused moment that the lamp had spilled. But the lamp had been blown out hours before, and the smell was not coming from inside the cabin. It was coming from outside along the back wall near the corner where the woodpile was stacked. And it was a great deal of kerosene, more kerosene than a lamp held, and it was being splashed onto the lower logs of the wall in a steady, careful rhythm by a man who knew what he was doing. Then she heard the voice. It was a low voice, low enough that she would not have heard it if her ear had not been close to the chinked log beside her pillow. It said, "Enough. That side too. Go." A second man's footsteps moved away around the corner of the cabin. The splashing began again at the south wall. She sat up. She did not light a lamp. She did not need to. She had been moving in this cabin for 6 weeks now in the dark, and she knew where everything was, as if her own body had drawn the room. She slid her bare feet to the cold board floor. She picked up the rifle. She worked the lever once very slowly, with a hand cupped over the action, to muffle the sound, and she felt the cartridge go in. She had no plan. Plan was a word that meant nothing in the small space of half a second. She had only a fact, and the fact was that 2 men in the dark had come to her cabin with kerosene, and the kerosene was not for any purpose she could think of that ended with her still living in the morning. She went to the door. She did not open it. She put her ear against the rough wood. She heard the splashing stop. She heard the rasp very clearly of a match being drawn along the strike strip of a tin matchbox. She lifted the bar from the door. She pulled the door open. She stepped out onto the small flat stone that served as her step in her stocking feet in the night with the rifle at her shoulder. There were 2 men. One stood at the corner of the cabin 20 feet from her with a tin can of kerosene tilted in his left hand and a smoking match cupped in his right. The match showed her his face for 1/2 second, long enough to see that she did not know it, that it was the face of a hired man, that the hired man was about her own age and was wearing a slouch hat with the brim turned down and had not shaved in a week. The other man was farther back at the edge of the trees, holding the bridles of 2 horses. She could see only his shape against the lighter dark of the sky, but the shape was a shape she had seen before, and the shape stood the way she had seen Garrett Thorne stand once in a hotel lobby in Helena, 4 years before, waiting for someone he was about to make uncomfortable. She fired. She fired high and to the right of the man with the match. The rifle's muzzle flash printed the whole scene white for an instant. The man's open mouth, the drop match, the splash of the kerosene can falling to the ground, the second man already turning away with the horses. And then the dark came back, and the report rolled out across the hill and went on rolling, and somewhere very far away, an owl that had not been expecting a rifle in the night gave one startled cry. She worked the lever. The empty hull pinged off the doorframe behind her. The next one, she said in a voice she did not recognize as her own, a voice flat and old and quiet as gravel will go through your belt buckle. "Go." The man at the corner of the cabin did not say anything. He did not look at her. He turned and he ran. He ran the way a man runs who has just understood in a single instant that he is not being paid enough. The man with the horses was already mounting. The match, where it had been dropped, lay smoldering in the wet grass, 3 feet from a kerosene-soaked log, and it had not caught because the wood was too damp from the night air, and because the kerosene had soaked into the bark and not pooled on the surface where a flame could find it. She crossed the yard barefoot to where the match still burned. She set her heel on it. She ground it out. The horses went out of the yard at a hard canter. She heard them across the wash and up the trail, and she heard them a long time after that, fading north in the direction of the river road that led in the end to the bottomland east of Pine Hollow. She did not need to be told whose bottomland it led to. She stood in the dark in her stocking feet with the rifle hanging from her right hand. Her left hand had begun without her permission to shake. She watched the place where the riders had gone until she could no longer hear them. Then she watched it longer. She did not go back to sleep that night. She sat on the threshold of the cabin in Ezra's coat with the rifle across her knees, and she watched the road. And at some point in the night, the moon came up over the eastern ridge and laid a thin, cold light across the yard and across the kerosene-darkened logs of the south wall. And she sat in that light, and she did not weep, although she could have. She had moved past weeping. She had moved into the place where a woman, if she were going to survive a thing, did her arithmetic instead. The arithmetic was simple. Garrett Thorne had decided that the slow, patient method of buying her off would not work, and he had decided that the next method would be to remove her from the property, and the kerosene had been the first attempt at that, and there would be a second because a man like Garrett did not give up after one. The second attempt might come in a week. It might come in a night. It might come, she understood, with a coldness that surprised her in a way she would not see and could not anticipate. A loose board on a ladder. A horse turned loose at a particular moment. A fire that started in the chimney one night when she was asleep, and that the inquest afterwards would call an accident. She could not go to the law. There was no law within a day's ride that would take the word of a widow against the word of Garrett Thorne. And even if there had been, she had nothing to give the law but her own account of two men she could not name, and a wet match on the ground. She had only one defense. She had to be inside the hill. She had to be inside the hill before the snows came, because the snows would isolate her, and the isolation would mean either that Garrett could not reach her at all, or that he could reach her, and no one would know what had happened. She had to be inside the hill with a heavy door at the cabin end of the passage, and a second heavy door at the chamber end, and the rifle within reach of her right hand at all hours. And she had to be there soon. When the gray light came up at last over the eastern ridge, she went inside, and she put on her boots, and she lit the lamp, and she went out to the chamber, and she began to dig. She dug that day from first light to last, and she did not stop to eat. She dug the next day and the next. She slept 3 hours a night. She woke at the smallest sound. She kept the rifle within an arm's length of wherever she was working, propped against a timber leaned in a corner. And when she walked from the cabin to the chamber, she carried it. The Olafson boy came by once on his father's errand to see if she needed anything brought up, and she met him at the head of the wash with the rifle in the crook of her arm. And she saw the way he looked at it, and she saw the way he looked at her, and she knew that by sundown there would be a new chapter in the tale of the mole woman, and she did not care. Garrett came back on the second Tuesday of November. She heard the wagon. She did not put the rifle down. She walked out of the chamber with the pickaxe in her right hand and the rifle slung from her left shoulder by a strip of leather she had cut from an old bridle. And she stood at the mouth of the hawthorn brake with her boots planted, and she watched the wagon roll into the yard. He looked at her for a long moment from the wagon seat before he climbed down. He was a man, she saw, who had been told by someone what he was about to find. He had braced himself. He was not surprised the way he had been on his first visit by the look of the place. He was not surprised by the dark mouth of the chamber. He was not surprised by the rifle. He was perhaps surprised by her face. She could not see her own face. She had stopped looking in the small piece of broken mirror she had nailed by the door, because the woman it showed her was not a woman she had been introduced to yet. He climbed down. He came across the yard slowly. He stopped 12 feet from her on the outside of a line that neither of them had drawn. but that both of them understood. "Della," he said. "Garrett. The town is talking. So you have said." He looked past her at the mouth of the chamber. The mound of spoil behind the cabin was now the size of a small barn. "My God," he said softly, "what have you done?" "I am winterproofing." Winterproofing. He said the word the way another man would say a foreign word he had not heard before. Winterproofing. "Yes. You are digging your own grave, sister. You are going to bring the hill down on top of yourself, and they will not even know where to look for you in the spring. This is no way for a decent woman to live. This is no way for any human being to live. You are making a mockery of my brother's memory, and you are making a mockery of yours. And the whole country is laughing at you, and at me, and at our name. I cannot have this anymore. I will not have it." She held his eyes. "My husband's memory," she said quietly, "is a stack of unpaid bills and a piece of ground. He was sold a lie about. His dreams left me with nothing but this. My madness, as you call it, may yet leave me alive. Yours will not. What did you say?" "You heard me." He looked at her a long moment. There was a small muscle under his left eye that had begun very slightly to jump. $100, he said. "I will give you $100 for the deed entire. You take it and you walk to town, and you get on the stage and you go, 'No. 125. No, 200. 200 Della in gold coin in my hand today. No." He stood. She could see the calculation going on behind his face. She could see him try to find the next number, and she could see him understand all at once that there was no number. He understood it the way a gambler understands at a certain point in a long bad night that the cards are not coming and will not come, and that the only choice left to him is whether he will rise from the table with dignity or without. He chose without. "You will be dead before Christmas," he said. "Do you understand me? Dead. And when they find you, I will sit at the front of the church and I will weep for you, sister. And I will buy the stone for your grave, and the stone will say, 'Beloved widow of Ezra,' and not one soul in this country will remember the look on your face the day you stood here and chose to die for spite." He turned. He walked back to his wagon. He climbed up. He took the reins. He looked down at her one last time, and his face had closed the way the face of a man closes when he has decided that what comes next will not be his fault, because what comes next will be done by other men and he himself will be at home. He drove away. She stood at the mouth of the hawthorn brake with the pickaxe in one hand and the rifle on her shoulder, and she watched the wagon out of sight. And when it was gone, she walked back into the chamber, and she swung the pickaxe at the rear wall, and she swung it hard, and a piece of granite the size of her head broke loose and fell at her feet, and she stood looking down at it, breathing. That was the day she began the passage. The chamber by then was nearly finished. Eberly's drawing had called for a room 10 feet by 12, 8 feet to the ceiling, and she had cut it almost to those dimensions. And she had begun to dress the walls with flat stones laid coarse on coarse, mortared with a slurry of clay and sand, that she mixed in a wooden trough by the cabin door. The drawing also called for a passage 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, running from the back wall of the cabin through the bank to the chamber, a distance of about 10 feet. A distance of about 10 feet on paper. In the ground, lying on her side in the dark, with a candle stuck to a flat stone by its own grease, swinging a short-handled pick by the inch 10 feet, was a journey. She cut the opening in the back wall of the cabin first. She used Ezra's old cross-cut saw She cut a low arch in the logs just above the line of the foundation stones, big enough for a person to pass through bent, and she trimmed the cut ends with a chisel, and she laid a slab of granite across the bottom of the opening for a sill. Then she got down on her knees with the pick and the candle, and she went into the bank. The passage was the hardest work of the project, and the most dangerous and the loneliest. The chamber she had been able to stand up in. The chamber had let in a little light through its mouth, and the air in it moved freely. The passage let in nothing. The passage was a coffin she was digging by hand on her stomach for the first 3 feet, and on her knees for the next 3, and every shovelful of clay and pebble had to be dragged backwards out of the hole on a square of canvas. She pulled behind her by a length of twine tied to her belt. On the 4th afternoon, when she had cut perhaps 6 feet of the passage and was lying on her side, packing flat stones against the right-hand wall, the roof came down. It came down without warning. There was a small, soft sound like the sound a sleeping animal makes when it shifts its weight, and then the world above her dropped. A column of clay and stone and earth fell on her from the waist down. The candle went out. The air filled with dust. She could not move. Her right arm was free and her face was free, and from the ribs down, she was held by what felt when she tried to shift it, like the entire weight of the hill. She lay very still. She did not at first panic. She had read in her father's library as a girl of men trapped in mine collapses who had survived by remaining calm and breathing slowly. And the reading came back to her now, with the clarity of a verse memorized in childhood. She breathed slowly. She moved her free arm an inch at a time and confirmed that she could move it. She moved her toes inside her boots and confirmed that she could move them. She was not, she understood, crushed. She was pinned. There was a difference. But pinned was in the long run not very different from crushed. Pinned with no one within shouting distance, and the cabin door closed and the candle out, and the air going stale, was a way of dying that simply took longer. She lay in the dark. The dark was the absolute dark of underground, the dark that has no edges and no direction. And after a few minutes she could not tell, when she closed her eyes, whether her eyes were open or shut. She heard her own breath. She heard her pulse. She heard very far away the steady tick of something settling in the fallen earth above her. A piece of stone shifting a clod of clay, slumping the long, slow process by which a collapsed roof goes on, collapsing for hours after the first fall. She thought of Ezra. She thought of him quite clearly. She thought of his hands, which had been narrow and pale and never strong. And she thought of him reading Wordsworth to her in her father's parlor, with one of those hands cupped around a teacup. And she thought how strange it was that she had loved him, and had not until this moment understood that she had also been for the whole of their marriage slightly ashamed of him. And how strange it was that she would die now, doing the thing he had dreamed of, and not had the strength to do. And how strange it was that her last clear thought before the air ran out was that she forgave him at last for having been the man he was, and not the man she had wanted him to be. She did not know how long she lay there. She would learn later that it had been about 8 hours. The light had been the gray light of early afternoon when the roof came down, and it was full dark above the ground when she heard the sound that woke her. She had drifted. She had not slept exactly. She had gone into some other place that was not sleep, and was not waking a place where she watched her own slow breathing from a little way outside herself. And time in that place did not run the way time ran above the ground. The sound was a man's voice. It was muffled by 10 feet of earth and a closed cabin door. And she could not make out the words, but the voice was calling her name. It was calling Mrs. Thorne, and it was a voice she knew. It was the voice of Silas Crow. She tried to call back. The dust had dried her throat to nothing. The first sound she made was a hoarse, small noise that would not have carried 2 feet, let alone 10. She tried again. She pushed all the breath she had against the back of her teeth, and what came out was a thin, reedy cry that she herself could barely hear. It was enough. There was a silence above. Then the voice came again, much closer this time, and she understood that Silas had opened the cabin door and was standing in the cabin and had heard her. He did not speak again. He worked. She heard above her the sounds of a man who had understood in 1 second what had happened and had begun in the second after that to dig. She heard the scrape of a shovel. She heard stone being lifted clear and set aside. She heard him breathing hard, and she heard him swearing once very softly in a way that was not blasphemy but was the prayer of a man who had no other language for the moment he was in. She lay in the dark and she listened to him dig, and she understood slowly the thing that he was doing. He was not digging down through the fallen earth from the cabin end. The fallen earth was unstable. To dig down from the cabin end would have brought more of it down on her. He was instead going up over the surface of the hill to the place above her, and he was digging straight down from there, a narrow shaft, fast and careful, until he reached the level of her body. He had read the situation the way she had read the wall of the chamber. He had read it correctly. It took him, she would learn, another hour and a half. To her, in the dark, with her air thinning, it might have been a day or might have been 10 minutes. She could not have said. She lay and she breathed and she listened to the sound of a man above her doing the work that would let her live. When the shovel finally broke through into the small pocket of air above her face, the rush of cold, cleaner air that came down through the hole was the most welcome thing she had ever felt in her life. It was sweeter than any draught of water. It smelled of pine and frost and the cold November night. Silas's face appeared at the top of the shaft. He had a lantern. The lantern light came down and laid itself across her face, and she shut her eyes against it, and she heard him say in a voice she had never heard him use, low and unsteady, "All right, Mrs. Thorne. All right. I have you. I have you now." He worked another hour to free her legs. He worked it slowly because if he worked it fast, he would bring down more on her. When he had cleared enough earth that she could move, he reached down and took her under the arms, and he lifted her. And he was 60 years old and not a young man, and she would never know where he had found the strength. But he lifted her clear of the ground and out into the cabin, and he sat her on the edge of the bed. She tried to stand. Her left side, just below the lowest rib, made a small sound when she tried to stand. And the small sound was the sound of 2 cracked ribs grinding together. And she sat back down. Silas knelt by the bed. He took off his coat and put it around her shoulders. "I came up," he said, not looking at her because you had not been to the store on Saturday. "You are always at the store on Saturday. I sat at home Sunday and I thought you were tired. And I sat at home Monday and I thought you were busy. And Tuesday I could not sit anymore." She tried to speak. Nothing came. "Don't," he said. "Don't speak yet. I'm going to build up the fire, Mrs. Thorne, and I'm going to make you tea, and you are going to drink it, and then you are going to sleep. And I am going to sleep in that chair by the door, with the rifle across my knees. And tomorrow we will see what is to be done about the hole in the ground that nearly killed you." She closed her eyes. The cabin smelled of cold and dust and kerosene that had soaked into the wood weeks ago and had never quite gone away. "Mr. Crow," she whispered. "Mrs. Thorne." "The hill," she said. "The hill nearly took me." He paused in the act of opening the door of the stove. "No, ma'am," he said. "The hill did not take you. The hill let you go. There is a difference. You remember the difference." He fed the stove. He set the kettle on. Outside, the wind had come up again and was working at the corners of the cabin, and somewhere far up on the high benches of the Bitterroot, the snow had begun to fall in a heavier way than it had fallen yet that year, and it was falling on a country that did not know what was coming for it, and on a woman who, broken-ribbed in her bed under a borrowed coat, had begun against every reasonable expectation to understand that she was going to live. The chamber was finished on the last day of November, and Cordelia Thorne stood in the doorway of it with a candle in her hand and looked at the thing she had made. It was not beautiful. She had not set out to make a beautiful thing. She had set out to make a thing that would keep her alive, and the thing in front of her had the shape of that intention written into every stone of it. The walls were dressed in flat granite laid course on course, each course mortared with the clay slurry she had mixed by the bucket, and each course pinned with one of Silas Crow's iron spikes driven deep into the seam behind it. The ceiling was a low arch of the same stone supported at intervals of 3 feet by the squared timbers that had once been meant for somebody else's well. The floor was packed earth, swept smooth, covered in the middle with 2 wool blankets laid one over the other. The walls held the light of the candle and threw it back at her in a soft gold color that did not move. In the back corner stood the pot-bellied stove on its hearth of flat stones, with the long, crooked stovepipe rising from its top and disappearing through the narrow vent she had chiseled in the ceiling. The pipe did not run straight. The pipe could not run straight because the slope of the hill above did not run straight, and she had taken the pipe up along the slope at the angle the slope offered her, anchored at 3 points to the granite face with the last of Silas's spikes. From outside on the surface of the hill, the pipe was an ugly black scar against the gray rock. From inside, the pipe was the single most important thing in the room. The pipe was the breath of the chamber. The pipe was the difference between a room and a tomb. She set the candle on the table. She knelt in front of the stove. She opened the small black door. She had laid the kindling in it that morning, the way she had laid kindling in stoves since she was 9 years old. And she struck a match on the stone of the hearth, and she touched the match to the kindling. The kindling caught. The flame climbed. The flame found the small pine sticks she had laid above the kindling, and the small pine sticks caught, and the flame found the split pine she had laid above those, and within 30 seconds there was a real fire in the stove, and the small black square of it was throwing heat into the chamber, and the heat was rising and spreading and pressing against the walls and the ceiling, and the walls and the ceiling were drinking the heat in the slow, patient way that stone drinks heat and would hold it. She watched the stove for a long minute. Then she looked up. The candle on the table burned straight. The flame stood as still as if it had been painted on the air. There was no draft against it from any direction. The flue was pulling. The chimney was drawing. The cold air she could feel against her ankles moving along the floor toward the stove. In a slow, steady river was the river of the draft. And the river was running the way Eberly's drawing said. The river should run from the cabin door behind her, down the passage, and into the chamber, and up the flue. And the river would not stop, day or night, as long as the fire was lit. She had built it. It worked. She sat down in the chair beside the stove. She did not weep. She had not wept in a long time. She sat in the chair, and she watched the candle burn, and she felt for the first time in 3 months the muscle in the small of her back that had been knotted tight as a fist begin very slowly to let go. Silas came up on the 2nd day of December. He came in his wagon with a load of dry pine cut to stove-length 2 full cords of it, and he did not say where it had come from, and she did not ask. He said only that a man down at Pine Hollow had owed him a sum on his account for 2 years and had paid it off in wood, and the wood was no use to him at the store, and she could have it for the price of his having to look at it in his yard. She helped him stack it along the inside wall of the cabin, which was no longer a cabin in any sense that mattered, but a porch a coal buffer the lung of her warm animal. They stacked the cords in 2 long rows that ran from the front door to the back, and the rows came up to her chin, and when they were done there was barely room to pass between them. Silas stood at the door looking at the stacked wood. He combed his hair back with 2 fingers. "Mrs. Thorne," he said. "Mr. Crow. That is a winter's wood." "It is. For a frame house, it is a winter's wood. For a chamber such as you have built, Mrs. Thorne, that is 2 winters' wood, and the second winter you will give half of it back to me, because you will not have burned it. I will not give it back. You will. I will pass it along." He looked at her then. He looked at her the way a man looks at another man who has at last said the thing he had been waiting for him to say. "All right," he said. "All right then." He climbed into the wagon. He took up the reins. He looked down at her from the seat. "There is one thing more," he said. "I had a wire this morning from a cousin of mine in Missoula. He is a clerk in the office of the railroad. He keeps me apprised of weather because his office has the glass and the wires from the stations west, and he likes to feel useful to his cousin in the back country. And most of the time the news is no news. This morning it was news." She waited. "The glass at Missoula," he said, "fell 2.5 inches between midnight and noon. The glass at Spokane Falls fell 3. The glass at Calgary, which has a glass that was set up by the Hudson's Bay Company in the year of '53, and which is the oldest glass on this side of the divide, fell so far this morning the man who reads it thought the instrument had broken. The instrument had not broken. There is a wind coming down out of the Northwest Territories, Mrs. Thorne, that has been gathering itself in the lee of the Arctic ice for 3 weeks, and it is coming down on this country, and it will be here by Friday at the latest. And my cousin has not used the words he used in the wire this morning since I've known him, which is 41 years. What words? He said it will be the storm of the century. He said the country is not ready. He said, tell your widow on the hill to bar her door. She nodded slowly. Tell him I am inside the hill, she said. He will not know what that means. You will. I will. Mr. Crow. Yes. You. In town. You have wood. I have wood. You have enough. I have enough, Mrs. Thorne. Do not concern yourself about an old man in a small house with a tight roof. Concern yourself about the thing you have built. The thing you have built is going to be tested in a way no man living has tested such a thing before. You will see this week what it is worth, and the country will see. He clucked to the horses. The wagon turned. The springs sang their thin metal song. She watched him out of the clearing and around the bend of the wash track, and the gray afternoon swallowed him, and she stood alone in front of the cabin. That was no longer a cabin with 2 cords of pine stacked behind her, and a hill above her, and a sky over the hill that had begun in the last hour to take on the color of a tin plate. The trapper came on Thursday afternoon. His name was Henrik. He was half Norwegian and ran a marten line up at Trout Lake, and he had been sent by Silas to carry the warning to every cabin between the lake and the river. He was a young man barely 20 with a beard frozen white from his upper lip to his collarbone, and he would not come in to warm himself because he had 3 more places to reach before dark. Mr. Crow says. Henrik told her the words coming out in plumes of breath on her doorstep. The storm will be here by tomorrow night. He says, bar your door. He says, do not come out for any reason until the wind drops. He says he will come for you when it is over. He says, do you understand? Tell him I understand. Tell him not to come. Tell him to look to himself. I will tell him, ma'am. Henrik, ma'am, you will not make Willow Creek before dark. I will, ma'am. I have made it before dark and worse than this. There has not been worse than this. He looked at her. He was very young. He had the wide, pale eyes of a young man who had not yet been taught fear by the country he had grown up in. And she saw that he could not be persuaded, because to be persuaded would be to admit that the country could kill him, and a young man who admitted that did not last in the country. God go with you, she said, and with you, ma'am. He went down the wash track at a slow, steady trot, the way a man goes who has many miles still to cover before he can stop. She watched him out of sight. Then she went inside and she barred the cabin door, and she went down the passage with the candle, and she did not come up again for 3 days. She made her preparations that evening. She filled every container she had with water from the spring, before the spring froze, and she carried the water down the passage in 2 buckets at a time. And she set the buckets along the back wall of the chamber, where the stove would warm them, but not cook them. She brought down the last of the bread Silas had baked her, and the half-wheel of cheese, and the bacon and the beans and the cornmeal, and the coffee, and the sugar, and the small jar of honey. She brought down the lamp, and the lamp oil, and the box of tallow candles, of which she now had 18. She brought down the Bible. She brought down the small stack of books from the crate Silas's wife had owned. She brought down the Winchester, and the box of cartridges and Ezra's old wool coat, which she still slept in, because she could not bear to put it away, and she could not bear to wear it during the day, and at night against the wall of the chamber. It was both a coat and a presence, and she had come to need it for both reasons. She did one last thing before she barred the inner door of the passage behind her. She went out into the yard in the early dark of Thursday evening, and she banked snow against the north wall of the cabin to the height of her shoulder. She did this with the long-handled shovel, working by the last of the gray light, packing the snow in hard against the logs, sealing the dead air cavity of the cabin against the wind that was coming. She knew the way an animal knows that the wind would be looking for any crack it could find, and she meant to give it none. When she was done, she stood in the yard for a long moment. The sky overhead had gone the color of slate. The air was utterly still. There was no wind at all, and there had been no wind for an hour, and the absence of wind was the worst sign of any she had read that autumn. The country was holding its breath. The country was waiting. She went inside. She barred the outer door. She crossed to the back wall of the cabin and ducked through the low, arched opening she had cut in the logs 3 weeks before. She went down the passage. She came into the chamber. She turned and she pulled shut the heavy plank door she had hung at the chamber end of the passage, and she dropped the iron bar across it, and she set her hand against it for one count of breath. Then she sat down in the chair beside the stove, and she waited. The storm came in the small hours of Friday morning. It did not announce itself. There was no rising wind, no scattered gusts, no warning at all. There was the long, still cold of the late night, and then there was a sound that began very low at the edge of hearing a sound like a great train coming up a grade from a long way off. And the sound grew and did not stop growing, and after perhaps 2 minutes, the sound was the world, and the world was the sound. And Cordelia Thorne, sitting upright in the chair beside the stove, where she had been dozing in her clothes, opened her eyes and understood that the wind had arrived. She could not hear the wind clearly from inside the chamber. She could hear it as a person hears the ocean, from inside a stone house, a quarter-mile up the beach. It was a long, muted rumble at the very edge of her hearing, a pressure, more than a sound, a feeling in the bones of her skull, rather than a noise in her ears. Above her 11 feet of hill. Above the hill a sky she could not see, and did not need to see, full of a wind moving at a speed she could not have guessed, and a cold she could not have measured. Around her in the chamber, the candle on the table burned straight. The flame did not move. The flame did not know that anything was happening. She built up the stove. She built it up to a small, steady fire. Not large, because she did not need a large fire, and a large fire would burn through her wood too fast. She put coffee on. She drank it slowly. She ate a slice of bread with honey on it. She read 3 chapters of the book of Job, because the book of Job was the place in the Bible where Ezra's letter had been hidden, and the book of Job was the place she went now when she wanted to feel her husband at her shoulder. She read about the wind from the wilderness that smote the 4 corners of the house. She closed the Bible. The day went by. She did not know it was day. She had no window. She had only the small brass clock Silas had brought up in his wagon 3 weeks before, and had set on her table without a word. And the clock said it was 4 in the afternoon, and outside the hill the country was being unmade. She slept that night in the bed against the side wall in Ezra's coat, with the rifle within reach of her right hand. She slept without dreaming. She woke at 5 in the morning by the brass clock, and she built up the stove, and she made coffee, and she sat in the chair, and she listened to the long, muted rumor of the world above her, and she did not feel afraid. She felt instead a thing she had no name for. It was not pride. Pride was a small and showy thing, and what she felt now was neither small nor showy. It was perhaps the feeling of a thing fitting correctly into another thing, the way a tenon fits a mortise or a key a lock. She had been made for a piece of work. The piece of work had been given to her by a country that did not care whether she did it or not. She had done it. The country had now come in its own time and on its own terms to test the work, and she sat inside the work, and the work held, and the holding of it was the meaning of every blister and every cracked rib, and every night she had not slept, and every dollar she had spent, and every glance of pity she had walked through in Silas Crow's store. And the meaning of all of it together was that on the second day of the storm of the century, in a country where 2 people would die that week, and many more would lose toes and fingers and stock and barns and roofs and the small dear things of their lives, she sat warm under a hill and read by candlelight, and was not afraid. She did not know yet that her brother-in-law was alive. She did not know yet that he was sitting at his own kitchen table, 15 miles away, with his hands in his hair, and the last of his wood going on the cook stove, and a letter in his coat pocket that had been written to him by his brother in August, and that he had not opened until the second night of the storm. She would learn this later, for now, on the morning of the second day, she sat in the chamber under the hill, and she did not know what she did not know. And she drank her coffee, and she waited. The second night was the worst. The wind dropped for an hour around midnight, and then it came back from a different quarter harder than before, and it came back with a cold inside it that her thermometer in the cabin above could not have measured, if she could have read it, because the thermometer's scale stopped at 30 below, and the cold that came in the second night went past that. The pipe in the back corner of the chamber, the long, crooked black pipe that carried her smoke up the slope of the hill, made a small singing sound she had never heard it make. Before, a thin, high, keening note like a wire under tension, and she understood listening to it. that the cold above the ground had reached a point where the iron of the pipe itself was contracting around the rising column of hot smoke, and the contraction was making the iron sing. The pipe held, the draft held, the fire held, the candle on the table burned straight. She slept again fitfully for an hour at a time. She woke. She built up the stove. She slept. She woke. The brass clock said 3 in the morning. It said 5. It said 7. It said 9. The morning of the third day came, and she did not know it was morning, and outside the hill the wind dropped a degree, and a degree more, and the country took its first careful breath in 70 hours. And somewhere on the surface, above her 15 miles east, a man set down a letter he had read for the third time, and stood up from his kitchen table and put on every coat he owned. She heard him before she heard him. That was the only way she could describe it later when she tried to tell the story of that afternoon to a young man from the Historical Society in Helena, who came up with a notebook in 1921. She heard him before she heard him. She had been sitting in the chair beside the stove with the Bible open on her lap and the candle burning straight, and she had looked up suddenly at the heavy plank door at the chamber end of the passage, and she had looked at it for a full minute before the first sound came down the passage to her. The first sound was a single hard knock on the outer door of the cabin. Far away, dulled by 20 feet of stone and timber and snow. Then nothing. Then a second knock, weaker. Then nothing for a long time. She set the Bible aside. She stood up. She took the Winchester from where it leaned against the wall, and she worked the lever once very slowly. And she crossed to the passage door and lifted the iron bar and set it on the floor. She opened the door. She went up the passage, bent at the waist, with the candle in her left hand and the rifle in her right. And she came up into the cold, dark cabin that was no longer a cabin. And she crossed it between the 2 long stacks of pine. And she set her hand on the bar of the outer door. "Who is there?" she called. There was no answer. She set her ear to the wood. She listened. She heard very faintly the sound of a man breathing. It was the kind of breathing she had heard before in the last weeks of Ezra's life. It was the breathing of a man who was not entirely sure he was still alive and who was using the last of what he had to find out. She lifted the bar. She set it against the wall. She opened the door. Garrett Thorne stood on the threshold. He was not standing. He was leaning against the door frame, and the door had been the only thing holding him up. And when the door swung in, he fell forward into the cabin and went to his knees on the board floor. His face was the color of tallow. His beard was a mass of frozen breath, white from his upper lip to his collar. The fingers of his right hand, which she could see, because the glove had split across the knuckles, were the color of bone to the second joint. Inside his coat against his chest, he was holding something. He held it the way a man holds the last warm thing in the world. He looked up at her. "Della," he said. The word came out broken. "Della, I have the boy. I have Samuel." She did not speak. She set the rifle against the wall. She knelt by him. She opened his coat with hands that were entirely steady. And inside the coat, wrapped in a quilt that had been his wife's, was a child of about 8 years old. And the child was breathing. And the child was alive. She lifted the boy. He was lighter than she had expected. She carried him through the cabin to the passage, and she ducked through the low opening, and she went down the passage with the boy in her arms and the candle gone out behind her, and only the warm yellow light at the far end to walk toward. And she came into the chamber, and she laid the boy on the bed, and she pulled the quilt up to his chin, and she set her hand against his forehead. He was cold. He was not so cold that he could not be warmed. She pulled the wool blankets up over him to his nose. She stood for one count looking down at him. He stirred a little in his sleep. He coughed once weakly, and the cough was wet. But it was a cough, and a child who could cough was a child who could be saved. She went back up the passage. Garrett was where she had left him. He had not moved. "Get up," she said. "I cannot. Get up. I will not carry you. You will walk under your own power into that passage, Garrett Thorne, or you will die on this floor, and I will not be the woman who carried her husband's brother through her own door." He looked up at her. There was something in his face she had never seen there before, in 11 years of knowing him. It was not shame. It was something underneath shame, something older. It was the look of a man who has at last understood the size of a thing. He got up. He used the door frame. He used the wall. He stood, and he swayed, and he walked on legs. He could not feel the 8 feet to the back wall of the cabin and the low, arched opening of the passage. He went down on his knees, and he crawled. She walked behind him with the candle she had relit, and she did not touch him, and she did not speak to him. And at the chamber end of the passage, he came up out of the hole on his hands and knees, like a man coming up out of a grave. And he stayed on his hands and knees for a long count. And then he looked up. He looked at the chamber. He looked at the walls of dressed stone and the timber ribs and the spikes driven into the seams. He looked at the small black stove in the back corner and the long crooked pipe rising from it and the candle on the table burning straight. He looked at his son under the quilt on the bed against the wall. He looked at the chair beside the stove where his sister-in-law had been sitting when he had knocked. He did not stand. He crawled to the bed. He put his hand on his son's forehead. He felt the warmth there. He bent his head down to the quilt and he stayed there a long time. When he straightened up, she was sitting in the chair. She had picked up the Bible. She had not opened it. She had set it on her lap with her hand flat on the cover. "Mary," he said. "Yes." "She is at the house. The stove. I have to." "You cannot. You will not make a mile in your state. You will not make 20 feet. Henrik came through 3 days before the storm. He stopped at your house. He told me so himself. Mary banked the stove. Mary closed the doors. Mary is in your kitchen with a quilt and what wood you had. And Mary is a stronger woman than you have ever given her credit for. She is alive. You will go to her when the wind has fully dropped and you can walk and not before." He did not argue. He had no argument. He sat down on the floor with his back against the wall, and he held his white hands out toward the stove, and he watched them. And after a long minute, he began slowly to feel them again. The feeling was not pleasant. He did not complain. She rose from the chair. She went to the small table along the wall where she had set the day's provisions. She poured coffee from the pot on the stove into the tin cup. She put 2 spoons of sugar in it. She brought it to him. "Drink." He drank. He drank slowly because his lips were not yet his own. He drank the cup down. He held it on his knee. "Della," he said. "Garrett, there is something I have to tell you." "Not yet." "Yes. Yes now, because I cannot. If I do not say it now, I will not say it, and I have. I have lived too long as a man who did not say a thing he should have said. I cannot do it again. Not on this night. Not in this room." She looked at him. She nodded once. He reached slowly with his left hand into the inside breast pocket of his coat. He took out a folded sheet of paper. The paper was creased and soft along the folds. The seal had been broken but recently. He held the paper out to her. She did not take it. She did not need to. She had seen the handwriting on the outside, and she knew the handwriting because the handwriting was the same handwriting that was on the letter in the Bible on her lap in the book of Job, where she had put it back the morning after Ezra's death, and where it had lived for 3 months. He wrote to me, too, Garrett said. His voice was very quiet. He wrote to me, the same week, the same hand. He asked me. He asked me to come in with him, to build it, to build this. He sent me a drawing of a man named Eberly. He said he did not have the strength. He said I did. He said to think of the boy. He could not say any more for a moment. I did not open it, he said. I did not open the letter. I saw the handwriting on the outside and I knew it was Ezra. And I thought I will open it after the funeral. And after the funeral I thought I will open it after the estate is settled. And after the estate was settled there was you, and the land, and the railroad, and I. I put the letter at the bottom of my satchel and I forgot it, Della. I forgot my brother had written to me dying and I forgot for 3 months. And the only reason I opened it tonight was because the wood was gone, and I had nothing else to do with my hands. And I sat at the table with my son, coughing in his mother's lap. And I went through my papers and I found it. She sat very still. I read it, he said. I read what he wrote to me. I read what he wrote to a brother who had called him a fool to his face and a fool behind his back for 15 years, and who would have called him a fool over his coffin if there had been anyone there to listen. He asked me, Della, to do this, to build this, with him, for the boy, for my own boy. And I did not open it. She set the Bible down on the table beside the chair. She opened the cover. She took out the letter that had lived in the book of Job. She unfolded it. She held it up so that he could see the handwriting. He wrote me too, she said. He looked at the letter. He looked at his own. 2 papers in 2 hands, the same date, the same shaking penmanship, the same dying voice reaching for the same 2 people from the same bed in the same week. I almost burned mine, she said. I held it over the coals. I thought he was a fool. I thought a poet to the end. I drew it back at the last second, and I do not know why. I put it in the Bible. I read it again the next morning. I went out, and I looked at the hill. And then I began. He bowed his head. You opened it, he said. I opened it. And I did not. And you did not. He sat with his back against the stone wall, and the tin cup empty on his knee, and the stove ticked, and the candle on the table burned straight, and from far above the hill the wind made a long, thin sound, and was gone. And the silence that came in after the wind was the silence of a country that had at last taken its losses and would in the morning begin to count them. Garrett Thorne lowered his face into his hands. He had not wept since he was 9 years old. He wept now. He wept without sound. He wept for a long time the way a man weeps who has at last understood that the brother he buried was not the brother he had thought he was burying, and that the woman across the room from him was not the woman he had thought he was buying off, and that the small warm room he was sitting in had been offered to him 3 months before, in a letter he had not had the decency to open. She did not go to him. She did not touch him. She sat in her chair beside the stove, and she let him weep, because she understood as she had not understood before that night that there are things a person has to do alone, and that to interrupt those things is to rob the person of the only payment the person can make. When at last he lifted his head, she stood up. She went to the bed. She put her hand again on Samuel's forehead. The boy was warm now. The boy was sleeping the deep, slow sleep of a child whose body had decided it was safe to rest. He would live. She had known he would live from the moment she lifted him from inside his father's coat. But she felt it now in her hand on his forehead, and the feeling was a kind of confirmation she did not need to put into words. She turned back to Garrett. He was still on the floor against the wall. "There is broth on the stove," she said. "There is bread on the table. You will eat. You will sleep on the floor by the bed where your boy is. You will not speak again tonight, because there is nothing more to say tonight that cannot wait for morning. In the morning, when the wind has fully gone, you will go home to your wife, and you will bring her back here because your house is open to the sky, and ours is not. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "Garrett." "Yes, Della." Ezra was right. Ezra was right. Say it again. Ezra was right. Once more. Ezra was right. She nodded. She sat down in her chair. She picked up the Bible. She did not open it. She held it on her lap with her hand flat on the cover, and she watched her brother-in-law eat the bread and the broth she set in front of him. And she watched him lie down, at last on the wool blankets on the floor beside his son. And she watched him fall into the kind of sleep a man falls into when he has, for the first time in his life, given up. She sat in the chair a long time after he had gone to sleep. The stove ticked. The candle burned. From far above the hill, the wind made one last long sigh and was gone for good, and the country settled into the great quiet that comes after a storm of that size, the quiet that is itself a kind of weather, the quiet in which a person can hear, if she listens, the slow, heavy breathing of a country counting itself to see what it has left. She listened. She heard her brother-in-law breathing on the floor. She heard her nephew breathing on the bed. She heard in the small ticking of the stove the heartbeat of the thing she had built. She heard behind all of it the deep, low, patient hum of the hill itself, which had held its temperature through 3 days of a wind no one in the country had thought possible, and which would hold it through the next 3 days and the next 3 weeks and the next 30 years, because the hill did not know about the weather, and the hill did not care. She closed her eyes. "Ezra," she said in a whisper that was meant for no one, "your brother came tonight. He brought his son. They are alive. They are inside the hill. You were right about everything. I am sorry I doubted you. I am sorry I almost burned the letter. I am sorry I did not believe a single word you ever said about a thing you could not prove. You were a better man than any of us knew. You were a better man than I knew. I am sorry. I am so sorry." The candle burned straight. The stove ticked. The hill held. Outside, above the granite spine of the bitterroot, the first stars of a clear, cold night came out in a sky that had not shown a star in 70 hours. The country, what was left of it, slept. And in a chamber 11 feet under a hill that no one had thought worth $50, 3 people who would have been dead by morning in any other house in the valley slept too in the steady warmth of an earth that had been waiting all along for someone with the sense to listen to it. She slept at last in her chair beside the stove, with the Bible on her lap and her hand flat on the cover. And she dreamed of nothing at all. And the dreaming of nothing was the best rest she had had in a year. In the morning, the wind was gone, and the country began to dig itself out. And the story of the hill woman of the Bitterroot which would in time become a story told in farmhouses and schoolrooms and historical society papers for 100 years and more, began very quietly in the small warm room under the hill to be a thing the country knew.